Again, sometimes it's about saving money, sometimes it's not. It's always hard. It's always hard for local governments to do this. It's frustrating to hear people criticizing local governments for not being collaborative without understanding the realities that local officials face. It's not selfish, it's not stupid, it's the reality of the position. It's very difficult for local officials to say, we're going to do this, and I know I may be criticized by some groups of constituents, but we're still going to do it because it's the right thing to do and we may be able to save money. It's hard. Okay? All right. So let me talk about two pieces of, two sets of data that provide some feel for what is actually happening. And I'm going to give you just a little preview before I get into the data. So I know it's right after lunch and it's sometimes hard to look at all the information and stay with it, but I'm going to talk about two surveys that were done, one in 2005 by the Citizens Research Council, and one that's done, that has just recently been done by the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy in the Ford School. The latter is very preliminary. I'm not going to talk quite as much about that, but the Citizens Research Council data consist of a catalog of services that local governments, about 400 local governments in, I have it on here. You guys are probably reading it. I can't find it in my notes, but, oh yeah, it's on the previous page, sorry. In 25 counties, 460 local units total, identified the mode of service provision for each of 116 different local government services. Excuse me. And the key factor here is that for each of those services, we asked, did you guys, did you as a government directly provide the service, provide it to, have it provided by, or jointly provide with another unit, in other words, collaborate, provide it through a special district, or which also includes school districts to the earlier point, contracts with a private provider, or doesn't provide it at all. It's not provided at all by the government in the local unit. What's interesting is that we're able to look both at patterns across different types of services, as well as different kinds of relationships. So we're able to look at both horizontal and vertical collaboration, for example. And so let me just really quickly walk you through this table. There's a ton here. I don't expect you to make your way through it, but really the main things that I want to talk about are, I've taken the top 10 or so services in each of the categories. So the percent of respondents who said that they self-provide the service, that's the first column, okay? And so things like administrative stuff like purchasing, like tax collection, treasury, accounting, and so on, very high percentages of respondents to the catalog said they do that themselves. They don't collaborate on that stuff. That's their internal office stuff. That's what they do, all right? And it turns out that a lot of that stuff, there really are not economies of scale. So maybe purchasing is probably an area where if my unit and your unit decide to purchase stuff together, we can buy in bulk and we can save some money. The problem is purchasing is not usually done, except for in the very biggest places, by a single individual. It's usually done by somebody who's already doing something else already. So you couldn't really save much. You might be able to save a bit on like the cost of a ream of paper, but there's not a lot of savings to be had there. It's sort of small scale. The next column is looking at the percent of respondents who report that they collaborate with other units at the same level. So it's either cities and cities, or cities and villages, townships and cities, and so on, okay? So that kind of collaboration. And the areas where that is most frequent are in fact the ones where the scale economies are greatest, okay? So things like firefighting, things like training, libraries, hazard materials, water treatment, sewer, other utilities, 911, ambulance, stuff like that. Those really are services where there are scale economies to be captured, where if my unit and your unit collaborate, we don't have to buy twice as much stuff, and we often don't have to hire twice as many people, and so we can do the same service for less money. And so on the one hand, you see high levels of collaboration in those areas. On the other hand, it's always less than half of the respondents, so there are a lot of units who are responding who aren't collaborating in those areas. Okay? So those are certainly something to keep in mind. Things like firefighting, training, other emergency services, utilities, and so on. A lot of the utilities stuff is, actually, I guess that wouldn't be horizontal. I guess, no, I'm sorry. So districts, special districts do count as horizontal. So in other words, if a city and a water district are providing services together, that does count here. So that's another thing going on here. And then finally, in the last column, we have vertical collaboration. And again, that's between cities, villages, or townships and counties, or cities, villages, and townships and the state, or county and state. Okay, so we're collaborating across local levels of local government. And here, a couple of these are sort of constitutionally determined. So roads, townships, and counties have a relationship with respect to providing roads. That means that most townships have roads provided by the county, so that shows up here, as well as courts. But many of these other things, like animal control, like crime lab, like emergency planning, like well permitting, that's stuff that really is skill economies, that you've got specialized people, but every unit doesn't need to have their own crime lab. Every unit doesn't need to have their own well permitting. Every unit doesn't need to have their own detention centers and so on. And so those are things that logically it makes sense that local governments would collaborate across these levels. And the percentages are pretty high, all right? So we're into the 60s and 70%, so quite a lot of that going on as well. That is an area where cost savings can be found, and I think the lesson here is that a lot of that's already being found. There's a lot of cost savings already happening through those kinds of collaborations. Okay, then the other piece of data, and I'll show you a couple tables from these data, are from the recent Michigan Public Policy Survey, again run by the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy in the Ford School, and in partnership with the EMS, MML, MAC, and MTA. And again, this is is it semi-annual when it's twice a year, or is that biannual? Twice a year. Semi, thank you. Semi-annual survey. It's right there. I guess I figured that out already. A semi-annual survey, again, of all of the local units in the state. We get about a 70% response rate, which is high, although the data are weighted to account for non-response, so they are reflective of the broader population of the cities, villages, townships, and counties. And the particular survey that we're looking here is fresh off the presses. Close-Up really hasn't even released the results of these data. I have talked to them about it, and much of what's here, I would ask you just before you cite it to talk to Close-Up about it, because it's not the final full version. But we really wanted to give you a sense of what's going on right now in collaboration in Michigan local governments. And so this is the freshest data that we have. And again, it's a couple weeks from being final, but I think it's kind of fun to have a sneak peek. Okay, so first and foremost, all of the respondents were asked, do you collaborate with other units of government? And clearly most do. It's, counties and cities report 90%, townships 67, villages 63. I think it's actually higher than that, because it's thinking about, we don't really define what collaboration means. And I think a lot of local governments do collaborate in ways that they don't recognize it as collaboration. So a lot of it on regional transportation planning, for example. I think some units probably do call that collaboration and others don't. So I think this underreports the extent of collaboration, but clearly it's high.